A case file survives for nearly a century, without a name, without a missing person report, without an opening scene anyone can follow back to its source. Only 3 sets of remains, and a few fragments of ordinary life left behind in the woods. And when those fragments are finally placed back in proper order, the most unsettling question stops being who did it, and becomes something colder: how a wrong piece of logic was able to hold its ground for so long. May 1935. East Middlebury, Vermont. A former logging road cuts through a stretch of pine forest. It does not lead to a house. It does not connect 2 communities. The road exists only because logging once required it, and when that work ended, the road remained unmarked, unnamed, and largely forgotten. For years, there was no reason to stop here. And because there was no reason to stop, there was no reason to look closely at the ground beside it. Along the drainage ditch running parallel to the road, a pale shape rises through the dark soil. At first, it resembles limestone. But when it is touched, it does not break apart. It holds its form in a way that immediately suggests it does not belong to the terrain. On May 15, 1935, Grace Daig and her daughter, Inez Perry Masterson, are walking along the edge of the woods, picking wildflowers. They are not searching for anything. They simply bend down and see the upper portion of a human skull. In that moment, a stretch of road that had gone unnoticed for years becomes the location of a case file with no name attached to it. The search that follows does not stop with a single set of remains. Within the same confined area, investigators recover 3 victims, an adult woman and 2 children. There are no documents, no personal identification, and no items that immediately establish who they were. Only their placement, and the manner in which they were left, indicates that this was not the result of an accident or natural exposure. Among the earliest records, one object appears repeatedly. A heavy canvas tote fitted with a pulley, designed for lifting or dragging. It is not camping equipment, and it is not something the surrounding environment would plausibly introduce on its own. At the time, it is noted as a detail. Over time, it becomes one of the few indications that these individuals were not simply lost, but deliberately concealed. What allows this case to persist for nearly a century is not the absence of information. It is that the information was arranged in a way that made the explanation feel complete, while a central assumption remained unexamined. And if the record was documented correctly from the beginning, then the question becomes which assumption quietly determined how the entire case would be understood for decades afterward. East Middlebury in the 1930s occupied the margins of the map. Scattered farms, dense woodland, unnumbered roads that existed more as remnants of industry than parts of a town. A place where a stranger could pass through without leaving an echo in local memory. In cases where identities are known, investigations begin with names. The name of the victim. The name of a family. The name of someone who reported a disappearance. Here, the case began with bones. The original file described the victims only through estimates. A white adult woman, approximately 35 to 45 years old, standing about 5 feet 2 inches tall. An adolescent, estimated between 13 and 15, sex undetermined. And a young boy, approximately 9 to 11 years old, around 4 feet 4 inches in height. This is the language a system uses when names are unavailable. Time of death was estimated at 1 to 3 years prior to discovery, placing the death somewhere between 1932 and 1934. Outside this forest, the country was deep in the Great Depression. Jobs were disappearing. Homes were being abandoned. Records became fragmented. Even during economic collapse, an ordinary family could vanish if they existed outside the networks that were routinely observed. The only confirmed connection between the victims, established decades later, did not come from memory or testimony. It came from science. Modern DNA analysis indicated that the adult woman was biologically related, mother to child, to at least one of the two children. The second child could not be conclusively linked due to insufficient genetic material. This is the quiet injustice of an unidentified case. When names are missing, the record cannot describe who these people were in life. It can only describe where they ended. Before May 15, 1935, there is no recorded moment of disappearance. No missing person bulletin was filed. No notice appeared in local newspapers. No names were posted at post offices, churches, or general stores. 3 people vanished, without leaving behind a single social marker, indicating that they had belonged to a specific place. In criminal investigations, silence is rarely accidental. A family, regardless of how unstable their circumstances may be, still has basic needs. They eat. They sleep. They stop somewhere. They purchase food. They ask for directions. They leave behind interactions, small, forgettable moments that nevertheless register in someone else's memory. A glance. A greeting. A fleeting familiarity. Here, that chain of interactions does not appear in the record. If the victims were alive at any point between 1932 and 1934, then logically, they had already disappeared from social visibility before their deaths occurred. It was not death that removed them from the community. The separation had begun earlier. This is what distinguishes the case from most homicides. During the Great Depression, mobility became ordinary. Families lost homes. Employment collapsed. Fixed addresses vanished. Entire households lived out of aging vehicles, moving between states in search of temporary work. When a house was left empty, neighbors did not ask where the family had gone. They assumed the answer. They went looking for work. In that context, silence did not provoke suspicion. It blended into the era. But one detail prevents the silence from fully aligning. Personal artifacts recovered near the remains, pearl buttons, feathers, thick fabric, do not match the profile of a transient family traveling light. These objects suggest a different reality. At some point, there had been a private, stable space. A room. A bed. Stored clothing. Items meant to remain in place rather than be carried. This introduces a question absent from the 1935 file, yet persistent behind it. If the family once lived with a degree of stability, what caused them to fall out of the systems that were capable of noticing their absence so quickly and so completely? There is no definitive answer. Only a logical boundary. They did not simply disappear. They exited the record before they were killed. And once a person is no longer visible to the system, their death does not trigger an alarm. This gap, rather than the forest, marks the true beginning of the case. Not the moment of discovery, but the days, weeks, and months in which no one recorded their continued existence. By the time the remains were found, there was nothing left to trace backward. Not because evidence was missing, but because the sequence had already collapsed long before the bodies were left in the woods. In the early 1930s, the forest surrounding East Middlebury was cut through by roads built for logging. They were not named. They were not numbered. Many never appeared on civilian maps. These roads existed for work, not for community. When the sawmills shut down, the roads remained, but daily life withdrew from them. On administrative records, they became blank space. On the ground, they remained wide enough for a vehicle to enter without attracting attention. Anyone familiar with these routes could move into the forest without creating a social trace. That is where the timeline begins. Not with the victims, but with access. Who knew a road without a name well enough to use it as a destination rather than a passage? Based on skeletal condition and environmental exposure, investigators estimated that the victims had died between 1 and 3 years before discovery. This places their death somewhere between 1932 and 1934. The window is broad enough to prevent a precise date, yet narrow enough to anchor the case firmly within a specific historical context. The Great Depression. Labor migration. Families moving across state lines without consistent documentation. If death occurred during this period, the question becomes unavoidable. At what point did they disappear from social life? And did that disappearance happen suddenly or gradually, without notice? At the site, the remains were located within a confined area. An adult woman. An adolescent. A young boy. There were no signs of formal burial. No evidence that natural forces had scattered them over time. Their positioning suggested placement. Deliberate. Controlled. From the earliest observations, the scene indicated intent. That intent introduces a structural problem in the timeline. If the act was intentional, then it required preparation. Movement. Familiarity with the location. This was not a spontaneous act by someone passing through. It required someone who knew where they were going and why. Local accounts describe direct violence. Gunshot wounds to the head. Several reports referenced a .38 caliber round, a common type in the 1930s. The detail offers texture but little resolution. Without a recovered weapon, the caliber narrows nothing. It frames the act as decisive, not chaotic. A gunshot can end life quickly. It cannot explain what happened before. Before the shot, someone transported 3 people, together, to a remote logging road, without producing a single remembered encounter. No witness recalled a family traveling that route. No report described a vehicle seen entering or leaving the area. The timeline remains intact only at its endpoints. Scattered near the remains were personal items. Pearl buttons. Feathers. Heavy fabric. These were not objects associated with a brief outdoor excursion. They were tied to domestic space. Sleepwear. Bedding. Interiors. They do not reveal where the victims lived, but they imply that, shortly before death, they occupied a room. A contained environment. A place where these items belonged. That raises a structural inconsistency. Why would fragments of an interior space appear in the woods? Why transport parts of a room, rather than simply the bodies, unless the goal extended beyond disposal? Among the recovered items, one object stands apart. A heavy canvas tarp fitted with a pulley. It was not recreational equipment. Not something wind or water would move into position. It suggested mechanical use. Covering. Wrapping. Dragging. More importantly, it suggested time. The presence of such an object indicates that the person responsible was not rushed. They had the means to manage the scene. Yet if concealment was the priority, the remaining artifacts present a contradiction. Why leave behind elements that pointed back to a lived environment? Another thread emerged through dental examination. At least one of the children showed evidence of significant dental intervention. In theory, this should have created a path back to records. In practice, it did not. In the 1930s, there was no national database. No coordination across state lines. Dental work could be performed through community programs, temporary clinics, or private arrangements that left no lasting trace. Without a missing person report, the system had no starting point. At the time, administrative absence was interpreted as social absence. No records became no connection. The assumption settled quickly and remained unchallenged. The question is not whether this interpretation was reasonable. It is whether it was correct. In 1988, the timeline fractured again. A large portion of original case files held by the Vermont Attorney General's office were mistakenly destroyed. From that moment forward, the case no longer existed as primary documentation. It survived through summaries, references, and retellings. When the source disappears, interpretation hardens. After 1988, earlier assumptions could no longer be tested against original material. Decisions made in the 1930s, right or wrong, became fixed. Not because they were proven, but because nothing remained to contradict them. When the case resurfaced in public discussion decades later, the task was no longer to locate a new clue. It was to reconstruct sequence. To examine whether the order in which facts had been assembled had distorted the story they were meant to tell. Because sometimes what is missing is not evidence, but alignment. And the unresolved question at the center of this timeline remains unchanged. At what point did a sequence of reasonable conclusions combine into a reading that no longer reflected reality? The turning point in this case did not arrive as a discovery. There was no late confession. No newly uncovered witness. No forgotten weapon pulled from storage. The shift came from something that had been present since the beginning, but never placed correctly within the narrative. When modern DNA analysis was conducted decades later, the results did not provide names. They did not identify a hometown. They did not narrow a suspect pool. In conventional terms, the findings appeared limited. But structurally, they changed everything. The adult woman was biologically related to at least one of the two children. A mother-child relationship. The data could not conclusively determine the relationship of the second child, but the implication was immediate and unavoidable. This was not a grouping of strangers. For nearly a century, the case had rested on an assumption that was never formally stated, yet quietly accepted, that three unrelated individuals had ended up in the same place by circumstance. That assumption allowed coincidence to function as explanation. The DNA result removed that foundation. Once the maternal link was established, coincidence could no longer carry the weight it had been assigned. The bodies could no longer be read as separate elements sharing a location. They had to be read as parts of a unit. And when that happened, the physical evidence reorganized itself. The canvas top with a pulley was no longer an isolated industrial object. The pearl buttons were no longer random fragments of clothing. The feathers were no longer dismissed as environmental debris. The dental findings were no longer technical curiosities. Together, they pointed toward a shared domestic existence. A life that included routine, privacy, belongings that made sense indoors. And that life did not end where the bodies were found. It ended earlier, somewhere else, and was transported. At that moment, the investigation's core question changed direction. The focus moved away from identity alone and toward proximity. Not, who were they? But who had access close enough to remove a mother and children from daily life without triggering alarm? That question quietly dismantles several long-standing narratives. It weakens theories built on random encounters. It reduces the plausibility of transient violence by strangers. It reframes the act not as a moment, but as a process. A process that required familiarity, time, and control. The turning point does not solve the case. It does something more fundamental. It corrects the orientation. From that moment forward, the East Middlebury case can no longer be understood as a mystery of anonymous remains in the forest. It must be understood as the structured disappearance of a family, one that was removed from recognition before it was removed from life. And once that shift is accepted, every remaining detail in the file must be reread in relation to it. Not in isolation. Not as coincidence. But as part of a system that, for decades, was asking the wrong question. Unidentified cases do not collapse because of what is missing. They drift because of what is assumed too early. In the years following the discovery, the investigation did not stall for lack of effort. It stalled because the framework guiding that effort was never re-examined. The file accumulated details, but the logic binding those details together remained fixed. Investigators began by reconstructing what they believed they already understood. The scene was mapped using contemporary descriptions. The logging road was plotted against later surveys. Distances to nearby towns were recalculated, not in miles, but in estimated travel time. Each step appeared methodical. Each decision appeared justified. What went largely unchallenged were the assumptions inherited from the moment of discovery. The first and most persistent redirection centered on the canvas tarp fitted with a pulley. From the beginning, it stood out. It did not resemble camping equipment. It did not align with personal belongings. It suggested industry, transport, hauling, concealment. That made it attractive to investigators. Objects can be traced. People are harder. Attention gravitated toward the tarp because it fit existing investigative models, supply chains, vendors, purchase records, ownership trails. The case leaned toward the question of where the object came from, rather than why it was used. As that focus intensified, the victims themselves became secondary. The tarp described a method, not a relationship. It explained concealment, not proximity. And while it occupied investigative energy, other questions remained underdeveloped: how the victims moved, who they trusted, and what social space they occupied before their disappearance. The second redirection emerged from a single technical detail repeated across early reports: the caliber. A .38 round. In 1930s America, it was a common specification, issued to police, carried by civilians, owned legally and illegally across state lines. Yet the number carried weight. A precise measurement gives the impression of narrowed scope. But without a recovered firearm, the caliber did not exclude suspects. It expanded them. The investigation drifted toward the abstract question of firearm ownership rather than the concrete question of access to the victims. Who had a gun was easier to imagine than who could move a mother and children without being noticed. The third redirection was quieter and more consequential. Dental work. One of the children showed evidence of significant dental intervention. In isolation, it suggested stability. Resources. A fixed address. Somewhere, a record might exist. This detail introduced optimism. It implied traceability. But it also introduced bias. Dental care in the early 20th century did not map cleanly onto class. It could come through charity programs, institutional care, temporary placements, or services rendered without durable records. By reading dental intervention as a marker of socio-economic status, the investigation risked narrowing its search prematurely. Entire populations, migratory families, informal guardianships, children outside official custody, slipped beyond the perimeter of consideration. The final redirection came from silence itself. No missing persons report. No family inquiries. No public claims. In a small community, that absence was interpreted as evidence. If no one came forward, the victims must not have belonged there. They were presumed transient. Outsiders. Unconnected. But administrative silence is not social absence. The early 1930s fractured record-keeping. Economic collapse severed family networks. Informal living arrangements went undocumented. When no report is read as no one left behind, the system absolves itself of further inquiry. The case did not end because leads ran out. It ended because its logic reached a point where continuation no longer appeared necessary. In 1988, that logic hardened permanently. A clerical error led to the destruction of much of the original case file at the Vermont Attorney General's office. Primary documents were lost. What remained were summaries, retellings, and inherited interpretations. From that moment on, the investigation could no longer verify its own foundations. Assumptions became reference points. Repetition became authority. When the case resurfaced decades later, modern investigators were not correcting mistakes. They were inheriting a structure shaped by reasonable conclusions drawn from incomplete context. Part 6 does not reveal where the investigation failed. It reveals how it remained coherent while slowly drifting away from the victims themselves. And that distinction matters. Because the most dangerous red herrings are not dramatic distractions. They are conclusions that feel sensible enough to stop questioning. At the outer edge of this case lies a boundary that cannot be crossed by interpretation alone. Certain facts remain fixed. 3 victims. 1 adult woman. 2 children. A remote location. Evidence of direct violence. Those elements are stable across every surviving account. They form the non-negotiable core of the record. Everything beyond that core exists under constraint. The absence of confirmed identities does not merely withhold names. It withholds timelines, relationships, routines, and social context. Without those anchors, the case cannot progress in the way most homicide investigations do. There is no last known address to return to. No employer to interview. No school records to consult with certainty. The case does not resist explanation because it is mysterious. It resists explanation because it lacks entry points. What can be said with confidence is structural rather than narrative. The victims were not randomly assembled. At least 1 child was biologically related to the adult woman. This establishes a family unit, partial but meaningful. It is the only relational fact supported by modern science. What cannot be confirmed is the nature of the second child's relationship. The DNA sample is insufficient. The absence of confirmation is not evidence of distance. It is evidence of limitation. Similarly, the physical artifacts recovered at the scene, buttons, feathers, fabric, do not tell a story on their own. They do not prove where the victims lived. They do not confirm whether death occurred elsewhere. They indicate domestic context, not location. They suggest, but they do not assert. The canvas top with a pulley remains a marker of method, not origin. Without a chain of custody, it cannot be traced backward to a source. It speaks to transport and concealment, but not to identity. To treat it otherwise would be to allow an object to substitute for a person. The loss of original documentation in 1988 imposes another hard boundary. Photographs, field notes, early correspondence, these are not missing details. They are missing controls. Without them, modern review must rely on second-hand descriptions that cannot be independently verified. Every conclusion must therefore be provisional. This is why motive remains undefined. Not unknown, undefined. There is no legal or ethical basis to assign intent without identity, relationship context, or corroborated sequence of events. Any narrative that claims otherwise exceeds the record. The same limitation applies to suspect profiles. Proximity can be discussed as a concept. Access can be evaluated as a requirement. But accusation cannot occur in the absence of corroboration. The file allows for inference. It does not allow for resolution. What remains, then, is not a solution but a reframing. The case can be understood as the disappearance of a family prior to their deaths. It can be understood as a failure of recognition rather than a failure of investigation. It can be read as a record shaped as much by administrative context as by criminal action. These understandings do not close the case. They prevent it from being misunderstood further. Part 7 exists to mark that boundary clearly. Not as a retreat from inquiry, but as a refusal to claim certainty where none can be supported. In true crime, restraint is not weakness. It is fidelity to the record. When the available evidence is placed back into sequence, a different structure becomes visible. Not a new conclusion, but a clearer explanation of how the original conclusions took shape and why they persisted. The first factor is systemic, not investigative. In the 1930s, there was no centralized mechanism for tracking missing persons across jurisdictions. Law enforcement operated locally. Records were physical. Communication between towns, let alone states, depended on correspondence, not databases. A disappearance only entered the system if someone reported it, and if that report stayed within the system's field of vision. In this case, no such report survives. From a procedural standpoint, the absence carried weight. It suggested the victims were not connected to the surrounding community. That assumption did not emerge from malice or neglect. It emerged from the way the system interpreted silence. Silence was treated as information. The second factor is cognitive rather than structural. Investigators gravitated toward elements that could be processed using familiar models. Physical objects, caliber descriptions, material anomalies. These were legible within existing frameworks. They offered something that could be catalogued, compared, and discussed with apparent precision. The top with the pulley fit this pattern. It appeared industrial. It implied procurement. It suggested traceability. As a result, it absorbed disproportionate attention, not because it mattered more, but because it felt more solvable. At the same time, relational questions were deprioritized. Family structure, living arrangements, social proximity. These required identities the system did not have. Without names, those avenues appeared speculative. And so they remained underdeveloped. This imbalance shaped the case's internal logic. A third factor involves the role of expert interpretation over time. Early forensic assessments were constrained by the tools available. Age ranges were broad. Sex determination was uncertain. Cause of death indicators relied on incomplete remains and environmental degradation. These uncertainties were acknowledged, but they also created interpretive gaps that later summaries often smoothed over. As decades passed, secondary sources began referencing earlier conclusions without re-examining their foundations. Each repetition hardened assumption into convention. By the time modern techniques became available, the narrative had already settled into place. DNA analysis disrupted that stability, but only partially. It clarified biological relationships. It did not supply names. It introduced structure without restoring context. This created an asymmetry, more certainty in one domain, continued absence in others. Experts reviewing the case today therefore operate under dual constraints. They must respect what the science confirms while refusing to extrapolate beyond what the record can support. This requires a deliberate narrowing of claims, not an expansion. From a systems perspective, the case illustrates a recurring pattern. When individuals fall outside formal reporting networks, their absence can be misread as insignificance. When records degrade, early interpretations gain disproportionate authority simply by surviving. Nothing in this process requires intent. It requires only momentum. Understanding that momentum does not solve the case. It explains why certain questions were never asked at the time and why asking them now remains difficult. Part 8 does not introduce new answers. It identifies the mechanisms that shaped the old ones. In 2015, the remains were formally buried. The grave markers do not carry names. They carry acknowledgement. An official confirmation that 3 lives, once reduced to case numbers and summaries, were recognized as individuals, even if their identities could not be restored. By that point, the case had already lived for nearly 80 years without resolution. What remains after such time is not mystery in the cinematic sense. There is no final reveal withheld just out of reach. What remains is something quieter and more difficult to confront, a record shaped by absence. The absence of names. The absence of reports. The absence of connective tissue between one jurisdiction and another. Over decades, the case became known as a local curiosity, 3 unknown victims found in the woods. That framing endured because it was simple. It did not require reconsidering how systems fail to register people who move, who detach, or who exist at the margins of formal documentation. But when the evidence is reassembled without narrative shortcuts, a different picture emerges. This was not simply a discovery in the forest. It was the endpoint of a disappearance that occurred earlier, elsewhere, and without recognition. The deaths closed a life that had already slipped beyond institutional notice. No surviving document tells us where that slip began. The timeline does not confirm where the family lived. The artifacts do not establish where death occurred. The science does not supply a surname. And so the case ends not with answers, but with constraints clearly defined. There is no official conclusion regarding motive. There is no legally supported identification of a perpetrator. There is no evidence that allows the story to be safely extended beyond what the record can sustain. What can be said, without speculation, is that the case illustrates how easily disappearance can precede death without triggering response, and how once that gap forms, it shapes everything that follows. The file does not prove malice by omission. It demonstrates consequence. If the timeline has been misunderstood, it is not because the truth vanished. It is because early assumptions were never challenged, and later evidence arrived without the context needed to correct them fully. The question that remains is not who committed the act. It is how many similar lives were lost to the same administrative blind spots, never recorded, never searched for, never formally missed. The truth, in this case, did not disappear. It was displaced. And until someone is able to restore the missing context, through identity, documentation, or connection, the record will remain exactly where it is now. Open. Constrained. Unfinished.